Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Mari Thurger and today I'm going to give you a few notes on Jörð, the earth goddess of the Old Norse pantheon. This was a question posed by one of my patrons, which I've answered that question long ago, obviously, but now I'm turning it into a video format. And speaking of patrons, for the very first time I'm using a new camera, so let's hope the video quality is way better than before. You will be the judge of that. By the way, this new toy would not be possible without the help of my patrons, and I want to thank you all for your contributions, your support, help, and most importantly, friendship. It's curious because before I started a YouTube channel 3 years ago, it took me 4 years to buy a camera so I could start this YouTube project. 4 years to buy a perfectly normal and cheap camera. I'm very happy to see that things have changed in a very good way, and because of my patrons, life isn't as fewer difficulties with the help of my patrons. Thank you very much, my dear friends, and of course I thank all of you subscribers and non-subscribers as well, who watch my videos and share them all across the online world. Now, let's not get over sentimental. This is neither the place nor the time. Let's start this video. After one of my latest videos about Thor and Jörmungandr, which you can see here by clicking on this information icon in this upper corner, today I would like to give you some notes on Jörð, since I have expressed on that video that there is a connection between Thor and both Jörmungandr and Jörð, as powers connected to fertility of the soils, of the earth. As I've said on that video, both the names Jörmungandr and Jörð have the exact same etymological root and express the exact same thing, a gigantic, a huge spiritual entity of the earth, earth as in the world. Of course, I could make a video solely about Jörð, but for now some notes will suffice, I think, to explain a few basic understandings on the figure of Jörð. So, Jörð literally means earth, and in the Norse myths that have reached our days, this figure is in fact rarely mentioned. We know she's a giantess, if such word exists, and also a goddess in Norse mythology, but she doesn't play an active role in Old Norse myths and poetry. And what we take from her is that she's also the mother of Thor. Supposedly, she's Odin's wife, but in the prose Edda, almost every male god is the son of Odin, as Snorre Sturluson equated Odin with the Christian god. Being the king of the gods, it makes sense to Snorre and Christians that Odin would also be the father of the gods, the male figure playing the father figure, generator of life. So if Jörð is Thor's mother, and in the Christian mentality Odin is the father of all the gods, automatically was created a relationship between Odin and Jörð. However, this isn't just a Christian religious mentality. It is perceptible, this religious idea, that femininity and the earth were characteristically connected among pre-Indo-European peoples. In other words, indigenous peoples all across Europe and all over the world for that matter, in most cases. With the arrival of Indo-European religious conceptions and the perception of the divine as being male sky deities, well, masculinity and the sky in that religious panorama was also connected. These are the most basic ideas in religions of the past. The junction of Indo-European religious beliefs with religious beliefs of the indigenous peoples all across Europe. They made a fusion between the conceptions of the divine. Quite often it was created some sort of connection between the sky, male gods, and the feminine earth goddesses, be that through marriage or through parenthood or even motherhood. This is a very old formula, so to speak, the marriage formula, the union of the sky god and the earth goddess, which maintains the cosmic order and bestows prosperity on the land as it is fertilized by the sun and the rain. Christianity has Roman influence more than it has Jewish influence. As a matter of fact, Christianity is a religious phenomenon taking shape in Rome, in classical antiquity, during the Roman Empire. And it obviously has a lot of Indo-European influences. Not to mention that the origins of the Judeo-Christian God among the Semitic nomadic tribes was once a male sky god, a storm god, who had a wife and followed this exact same formula. Yes, some people like to talk a lot about Indo-Europeans and often purposely forget that such a cultural phenomenon also spread and influenced cultural realities among Afro-Asiatic peoples, and obviously vice versa. It's called cultural syncretism, often purposely forgotten to reinforce certain political views. Anyway, there is always this perceptible religious tendency over the centuries to transport human relationships to the divine sphere, and the earth goddess is always somewhat connected to the sky god, either through marriage or parenthood or motherhood. However, before Indo-Europeans and before structured religious beliefs controlled by a hierarchical social group, animism was the most widespread religious phenomenon, and it wasn't different among the ancient Scandinavian peoples. As we shall see further ahead, don't worry, I shall explain all of this. In heathen times, in pagan times in Northern Europe, animism was still very much alive. And Jörð, being the earth and Thor's mother, it was a reference to more of a general concept, as in focused in ambience, focused in natural phenomenon observed in these people's societies, and not a particularly mythological figure, which is why, or one of the reasons why, Jörð rarely appears in the literary sources and comes more often in folk tradition. Before the Norse and other Germanic peoples converted to Christianity, the divine personalities were never officially established. There was no ordering of the divine conceptions yet, and surely there weren't rational traits imposed in the divine. The gods had not yet been rationalized, like they are in modern storybook versions of mythology, and even in Snorre Sturluson's Prose Edda. Everything was still quite animistic before the Christianization. The heathen peoples, the pagan peoples of Scandinavia, wouldn't have necessarily feel a need to explain exactly who Thor's mother was, and who was Thor's father, and who was Jörð's husband, and so on and so forth, and trying to create some rational, natural, human connection. To the pagan Norse, as well as, well, other pagans who still retained animistic conceptions of the spiritual, Jörð, being the earth was good enough. No need for explanations and creating a family tree, so to speak. Jörð was the living spirit of the earth, and Thor was the animistic living spirit of the storm. But we shall see this further ahead. One of the most relevant myths in which Jörð is mentioned is in the creation of the day, night, the sun and the moon. Snorre Sturluson described the creation of the world and the stars and other celestial bodies as having been created by the sons of Thor, Odin, Vili and Ve. But soon after this, he explains something completely different without any interruption or any explanation. It's an alternative myth. Jörð is the daughter of Not, night, and of Anar, literally another. It seems clear that the sources Snorre had in hand did not fully explain the origins of Jörð, the origins of the earth, and the role of this figure in the older myths, which is understandable, because in older recorded literary sources before Snorre's time, Jörð appears to have been only known as Thor's mother, already in the late heathen period, the late pagan period in Scandinavia. In such accounts, she plays no further role as an earth goddess. So even during heathen times, late pagan times, she had already been forgotten, at least among the peoples in great urban centers, which makes things quite difficult for us to understand the meaning and the role of Jörð in the pre-Christian Scandinavian heathen mentality and religious panorama. She was clearly an earth goddess, but not much survived in the oral and written traditions about this mythological figure. And even Snorre himself in the 13th century already lacked information about her, about Jörð. We can see she was no longer relevant among Scandinavians by the end of the heathen period, by the end of the pagan period, which is also understandable given the focus of the Scandinavian heathen society on sky gods and less on earth gods, earth deities, both gods and goddesses. Moreover, the written culture, the habit and custom of writing and recording everything in a written form was introduced by Christianity. Those who knew how to write belonged to specific powerful groups of well-educated people among the nobility, among royalty even, among the elite, often Christian priests, clerical workers, skalds writing for a wealthy patron with high social status. So, what was being recorded, including the religious reality, was on the perspective of the elite, the rulers, the people who held a specific religion, a religion of the state, so to speak. Every other religious reality outside this social panorama was rarely being recorded. Religious realities from remote areas, from the countryside, for instance, were a completely different thing. And such people often kept older forms of spirituality, older forms of religion. Which is why we seldom have written sources on Jörð. There's a reason why she is also considered a giant. The giants, the Jotnar, are actually older gods before the sky gods, animistic understandings of the natural world. The worship of the Jotnar, the giants, was real, it existed, and those are the older perceptions of the divine. That was, however, not a religious reality among the elite. The Jotnar were the gods of the farming communities, of the tribal communities, more primitive. Primitive not in as the opposite of something more sophisticated, but primitive as in older, more archaic. So, even though we don't know much about Jörð because of the lack of written sources about her, well, let's face it, because no one was very much interested in recording the pagan religions far from the urban centers and not belonging to the official religions of the state. Well, fortunately, we have information about Jörð in the archaeological record, being invoked in various charms and also spells and prayers among the pagan farming communities. Jörð is often mentioned in magic spells, and one particularly cultic practice attested to her involved the pouring of milk and honey into the soil of the farmland, asking for her blessing during the process and while reciting the charm. The charm was recited when the plow cut the first furrow of the growing season, and milk, honey, flour and water were poured into the soil. Now, this is particularly interesting and curious because we see that exact same practice in the cult of Freyja among farming communities, obviously. The cult of Freyja was one of the most important religious realities of the state in heathen times, in pagan times in Scandinavia, which shows that at a certain point the religious reality of the elite was introduced to the more remote communities, and Freyja took over the role of Jörð as earth goddess. The same ritualistic practice involving milk on the crops expressed to call upon the blessings of Jörð were transported to the cult of Freyja as well. Many cults to other deities, older deities, were incorporated into the religious panorama of the elite, which is why most pagan deities were lost, and we end up almost always with the same dozen gods and goddesses as well, with 100 traits and 100 skills and 100 different names, because eventually many other gods were incorporated, or rather absorbed into other forms of religious conceptions. It's often the religions of the elite completely overshadowing the religions of the common folk. But in the alternative myth I was speaking of, invoking the origins of Jörð, the night dot gives origins to Old, prosperity, gives origins to Jörð, earth, and also Dagr, day. Snorri gives us two different myths in the same account: the world created by Odin and his brothers, trying to seek parallels with the Christian myths of God creating the world, and then, soon after, gives us a myth which seems to be far older, in which it is the night that gives birth to the world. Not is described as being black and dark. Obviously, it's literally the dark aspect of the night sky, without any celestial bodies, as they had not been created yet. There was only darkness without the sun or the moon, and it is the darkness, the night, that gives birth to the world and its celestial bodies. Note, the night has a horse named Hrimfaxi, and it is this horse that brings the night. Hrimfaxi means icy or cold mane. To Knut's son, Dagr, day, was given another horse, named Skinfaxi, meaning bright mane. This myth is presented to us by Snorri, and he states that these horses were given by Odin, implying that Odin already existed before existence itself. Again, equating Odin with the creator god of Christian mythology, Judeo-Christian mythology. But this is the curious part, because he forcibly tried to include Odin as the creator god and male god of creation, but this myth clearly demonstrates a myth of creation far older, not Indo-European, but from an animistic spirituality of the indigenous peoples of Scandinavia, who most likely lived in a matriarchal society, given this account of a female goddess creating the world. So instead of being Odin and his brothers creating the earth, the world, it is the night itself, thus appearing as a kind of cosmic matriarch. But more on this on some other video about the creation of the earth and its cosmic bodies. But this just makes you wonder about Ginnungagap and Snorre speaking about nothingness in the beginning, in the creation myth, expressing Christian understandings of the creation myth, of the creation of all things. Ginnungagap might not have been nothingness after all, but simply the state of existence when there was only the night, as an everlasting darkness expressed in this older creation myth. As said before on the previous video, which you can watch by clicking this information icon on this upper corner, the name Jörð is linked to the word element Jormun, also found in the name for Odin, Jormundur, or the great world serpent, Jormungandr, and another name for the earth as well, Jormungrundur, or the personal name Jormunrekre, and also Old Saxon Irminsul, world pillar, old denoting something big, something great, something huge. Furthermore, throughout Eddic and skaldic poetry, Thor's mother is also called Fjörgen or Ljoden, and also Fold and Grund. And all these names, including Jörð, are all mean the exact same thing, earth. They don't seem to be different characters or different names for the same entity, given the context. What is likely to be implied here is that Thor is the son of the earth, the son of the world, but not a specific earth goddess. Earth as a general concept, as I've said before. Thor being the son of the earth. This can be found in various accounts such as Auslong, Hrimskvida, Lokasena, Gylfaginning, Skaldskaparmal, and so on and so forth. Thor is frequently said to be the son of the earth, not as a goddess, but as the earth itself, the world in which we live in. It's possible that what we are dealing with here is a far older animistic understanding before the introduction of Indo-European religious conceptions, and well, certainly before the Christianization of Scandinavia, obviously. You will notice that in various European myths, Greek mythology is a perfectly good example of this. There are always seem to exist gigantic beings ruling the earth or living in some space before the sky gods of war and order. This is not something random, and it is perceptible in many Indo-European mythologies. This is the reflection of the Indo-European entire cultural system coming in contact with indigenous animistic spiritualities based on the veneration of earth deities. The panorama of sky gods triumphing over gigantic creatures. Norse mythology, Thursar, Jotnar, Greek mythology, the Titans, well, giants. Is precisely the subjugation of Indo-Europeans over the indigenous peoples and their native spiritualities. Some of the earth deities of pre-Indo-European peoples have been incorporated into the religious conceptions of Indo-Europeans, and thus we have many accounts of sky gods getting married with earth goddesses and earth gods, gigantic beings, or having sons with earth goddesses. It is the integration of different religious conceptions and the patriarchal social system of Indo-Europeans overshadowing the more matriarchal cultures of the indigenous peoples. This is even perceptible in the Bronze Age social system. The chieftain of the tribe or the group or the community or people in general holds the military, political and religious power, while his wife holds the magical power. The marriage between sky gods and earth goddesses reflects the very real integration of cultures or cultural syncretism. The Indo-European entire patriarchal warrior system based on the conquering of land and therefore veneration of sky gods of war, with the matriarchal cultures based on fertility goddesses and gods who were conquered and integrated into the Indo-European cultural system. The marriage of the warlord with the matriarch of the community he conquered to form an alliance between the two ruling powers. One of the most important social institutions among Indo-Europeans was the war band, an organized military society presided over by a chieftain and by his wife when Indo-Europeans came in contact with various indigenous peoples who maintained a matriarchal or a more matriarchal system. The wife of the chieftain or the warband's leader held the role of sorceress. She was the one who could foretell the outcome of a suggested plan of action by means of divination and to influence that outcome by means of active magic. And she too held much of the religious ceremonies. These women still held to the native religions of their forefathers, of their ancestors, and still played the role of fertility and magic of the earth deities. However, the role of women in the religious panorama of pagan cultures was progressively put aside as these societies became more warlike, and the religious sphere relied much more on war sky gods. As such, the older earth goddesses start to disappear from the religious panorama. Not just the earth goddesses, but the older gods as well, the giants, the titans, the Jotnar, the Thursar, start to disappear and are often portrayed as the enemies of the sky gods. As said before, by the end of the heathen period, by the end of the pagan period in Scandinavia, Jörð, as an earth goddess, no longer held an important position in the oral tradition and also, subsequently, literary works. So Jörð seems to have been the typical earth goddess of a pre-Indo-European past. But what exactly is her connection with Thor? Well, it's clear that Thor is a warrior deity, and we are dealing with the typical case of the sky warrior deity of the Indo-European religious conceptions. However, it's unlikely that Thor was originally a warrior god before the introduction of Indo-European religious concepts, and that in fact Thor is an older deity. The connection between Thor and Jörð is, or seems to be, far older, and indeed seems to come from an indigenous animistic religious perception. Thor literally means thunder, and before becoming a warrior god, a male sky god related to war, most likely sometime during the Bronze Age, Thor was the animating spirit of the storm whose rain fertilizes the fields. That's the connection between Thor and Jörð, or thunder and the earth, an animistic conception of the fertility aspects of the sky over the earth. Thor, in this case thunder, is the living spiritual manifestation of the power of storms that brings rains and fertilizes the soils. Thor, in an animistic past, must have been indeed understood to be the son of the earth, as the sky phenomenon is the product of the earth, of the world, and manifests itself on the earth. And that much was still kept in the myths, at least. It's no coincidence that Thor's wife is Sif. Sif's most noted attribute is her long golden hair, which was understood to be a field of grain ripe for harvest. Thor, thunder, is the animating spirit of the storm that sends down rain that comes in contact with the fields to produce fertility and the growing of the vegetation. A marriage between the powers of the sky and the vegetation that produces food, Thor and Sif. Thor is the son of the earth. It is the thunder of the storm that is the manifestation of the earth. It manifests in this world. I wouldn't be surprised that Sif, in some older myth, forgotten myth, was also the daughter of the earth. And here we would have a panorama of incest, which is why among the Vanir gods, gods of peace, planting and fertility, it is often mentioned that incest is allowed. This incest idea is a later human perception towards older animistic concepts of fertility powers, which are the product of the same parents. Animistic understandings didn't see this as incest, but merely fertility powers, fertility spiritual powers, which are the manifestation of the earth. And such powers were later anthropomorphized, creating a parental or motherly structure of sons and daughters, coming from earth deities, and those same sons and daughters coming together to propitiate fertility, Thor and Sif. And this led to the idea of incest because the animistic spiritual entities progressively gained human traits, and therefore their connection is seen in humane perceptions. It was never a case of incest, but a case of animistic notions of fertility powers, manifestations of the earth coming together to propitiate life. Right, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and thank you so much to all of you and to my patrons, which I will put a list of their names in the end of this video, so stick around. And once again, tack för idag!